It's officially Combine Week in Indianapolis. Who will John Schneider and the Seahawks have their eyes on this weekend at the NFL Combine? We'll be breaking it all down here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s, whether you're listening in Rob's neck of the woods in Tacoma, Washington, or across the country in Jacksonville, Florida. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. It's NFL Scouting Combine Week in Indianapolis. We will have some live coverage from Indy this week throughout the week on the show. We're going to be diving into some players on offense and defense that we think could be intriguing for the Seahawks to watch. And it's our fans' favorite Mock Draft Monday. We're going to be diving into fan submissions, the first 3 rounds from 4 selected mock drafts today. So we're going to be diving into a lot of prospects. It's going to be a really fun episode that's brought your way by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Prospects, coaches, executives, scouts, you name it. They are all descending upon Indianapolis for the annual NFL Scouting Combine. Over 300 prospects looking to earn themselves some dollars with their athletic testing, their meetings behind closed doors, and their medicals. Maybe the most important part of the Combine. The Seahawks will be taking care of business without Mike Macdonald or any of their coaches in Indianapolis. This is going to be a new era at the Combine for John Schneider. No Pete Carroll alongside him. It's all John Schneider, and I'm sure he's got some of his front office staff there as well. But certainly different situation for John Schneider. That may not change how they're going to evaluate some of their position groups, but it could have a bearing on what positions they'll be looking at. And obviously, Rob, we could spend this whole segment talking about quarterbacks. We know every team is going to be watching Michael Penix and Spencer Rattler and all these quarterbacks that are expected to throw at the Combine. Players like Jaden Daniels are not going to throw in Indy, but the ones that do, all eyes are going to gravitate to them. But I want to look at non-quarterbacks, some players, some prospects that you think would be worth watching for the Seattle Seahawks that are on your radar this week.
Well, not only on my radar, Corbin, I think they're going to be on John Schneider's radar. I think that, it's interesting that you mentioned that Mike Macdonald is not going to be at the Combine for the Seahawks this week. And one of the things that really struck me when Macdonald was initially hired and introduced to the Seattle media is how we talked about the fact that the scouting, the board for the Seahawks and for the Baltimore Ravens were often very similar. And Eric DeCosta is now the general manager of the Baltimore Ravens. Previously, of course, the great Ozzie Newsome was the general manager there, and how Seattle and Baltimore's boards were so consistent. And so one of the things that I believe, and I believe that John Schneider and Eric DeCosta, again, the general manager of the Baltimore Ravens, would believe is that the absolute best class, the best positional group this year happens to be along the offensive line. So I really believe that the Seahawks are going to be focusing in on the offensive line, not only because it is a possible position of concern for Seattle, but again, just because it is the unique positional group of this year's draft. And so to me, 2 of the players that make an awful lot of sense for the Seahawks to be paying a great deal of attention to would be a player in Troy Fautanu, who was the Morris Trophy Award winner this past season. Has a 2-year starter at the left tackle position, also has a little bit of experience at that left guard position. J.C. Latham from the University of Alabama, who is not only starred at the right tackle position, also has some experience at right guard. positional flexibility, size, physicality, athleticism, those have always been hallmarks, not only of what John Schneider has tried to bring to Seattle, but what Eric DeCosta and Mike Macdonald, John Harbaugh have always brought to the Baltimore Ravens as well. That to me is where the conversation begins, is again at the offensive tackle / offensive guard positions. I mentioned two of these players here in Fautanu and Latham who have positional versatility. Corbin, these are going to be guys who are going to be selected in the first round. If the Seattle Seahawks decide to stay at number 16 overall, I really believe that Troy Fautanu and J.C. Latham are either going to be Seattle selection number 16 overall, or they may be selected before Seattle's even on the clock. But these are two of the players that I think the Seahawks are going to want to not only watch how they perform in terms of workouts, but definitely interview them throughout this process, because I do believe that these are going to be a couple of the players that the Seahawks are going to be very much focusing in on as possible their selections at number 16 overall.
I think there are several other offensive linemen that could be under the microscope as potential first-round picks. And we have talked about this player a little bit, but now that I've had a chance to watch more of his film, it was a little more tricky to get all 22 for the Duke Blue Devils. But Graham Barton, you want to talk about a player that just brings a nastiness, a physicality that I don't think is matched by any offensive lineman in this class. There are times his technique betrays him, but that is something that you can coach up. And what I'm most excited about, a lot of times when fans listen to discussions about offensive linemen, they think athleticism has to do just with quickness or foot speed, the ability to slide. And yes, that's obviously a big part of it. But athleticism also is a big part of the functional strength aspect when you're blocking, and the explosiveness out of your stance to fire your hands into defenders. And Graham Barton is as nasty and as quick getting out of his stance as any offensive lineman in this class. I think he is better suited to be a guard at the next level, because I do have some reservations about his ability going against speed off the edge. But I see the footwork. I see the quickness. I see a guy that obviously checks off all the boxes in terms of the physicality and nastiness. Seemed like he'd be the kind of guy that Baltimore and Seattle would have interest in on the offensive line. And going to the later rounds, I think this is a really intriguing tight end class. I want to see how the tight ends work out. And in particular, former player of mine at Mount Si, Jack Westover from the Huskies. I want to see what Jack Westover does in this combine, because I have a feeling that he could be one of those guys that isn't on Bruce Feldman's top 25 freak list, that afterwards you're going to say maybe he should be on there, because I've watched this guy jump out of a gym. I have seen this guy do spin around dunks, and that was back in high school. Now he's 250 plus pounds. He's a good blocker, really solid receiver, but I'm excited to see what Jack and his teammate Devin Culp do in the athletic testing this week. As for the defensive side of the football, Rob, I know that this is mostly going to be an offensive segment for you, but I know there's one defender in particular that you think the Seahawks are going to be monitoring very closely this week in Indy.
Well, again, I think that Mike McDonald, even if he's going to stay in Seattle, is going to definitely have his kind of binoculars out and trying to watch what the linebacker Junior Colson, who McDonald, of course, coached in Ann Arbor to a great deal of success. This is a 3-year starter, the guy I like to call the Haitian sensation. Spent the first 9 years of his life in Haiti before moving to the United States, he and his family, and of course became a star for the national champion Michigan Wolverines. Corbin, he led the Wolverines. This is a team that is absolutely filled with NFL prospects. I mean, they broke the record this year with 18 players who were invited to the combine. That's more than Georgia, more than Alabama, more than any other team in college football history has ever sent to the NFL scouting combine. And I think Junior Colson, the inside linebacker, he's at least listed by Michigan at 6'3", 245 pounds. I'm curious to see what that size is, if it's actually legitimate, and if the sideline to sideline speed, if the explosiveness in the testing, if the short shuttles and the change of direction drills, if all of those things translate as I expect them to, based on what I've seen on film, where he was a 2-year leader of the Michigan Wolverines in terms of overall tackles. He has demonstrated his ability as a pass rusher as well as dropping back into coverage. I see instincts, I see speed, I see power. I see all the attributes that you need to be successful, to be an inside linebacker in Mike Macdonald's scheme. And so I don't see a lot of linebackers in this year's draft class, Corbin, who I view as possible first-round candidates. I think if the Seahawks were going to go with Colson, it might be a second-round selection. Seahawks don't currently have a second-round selection, so a possible trade back, maybe even if he is that impressive, because I don't love this linebacker class in terms of the prospects who were available in this rookie draft class rather than the free agents. I do think that he is a possibility for the Seahawks in a possible trade back scenario. But still, my point is that if you are going to look for a defensive player who absolutely checks the box, considering that all three of Seattle's linebackers, Bobby Wagner, Jordan Brooks, and Devin Bush, are free agents, then Junior Colson is a player that I'm excited about. And I love that you mentioned the tight ends, by the way, the University of Washington, Jack Westover, Devin Culp. My druthers, if the Seahawks are going to select a tight end, sure, I'd love to have Brock Bowers from Georgia just fall into their laps. I think that he's going to be gone probably 10 spots ahead of where Seattle is at. But if there is a tight end other than Brock Bowers who could go in the first round, Jatavian Sanders from Texas is another player. I would mention, a couple of other prospects that really would make some sense. The kid from Ohio State, Cade Stover, is another one who I'm really intrigued by. But Jatavian Sanders in particular, he is a guy who I think is going to absolutely splash in these combine settings. And he is a guy that, again, I think that the Seahawks have some concerns with the tight end position. And Jatavian Sanders, with his athletic ability, would make some sense in a possible trade down scenario for the Seahawks in the first round as well.
Yeah, sticking with linebackers real quick, for me, as you mentioned, Junior Colson has been extremely productive for Michigan. But if you want to talk about productivity, Cedric Gray at North Carolina, he's a little lighter. They list him at 232 at the Senior Bowl. That's around his playing weight. But he plays like he's 245. He gets downhill. He whacks people sideline to sideline. 266 combined tackles the last 2 years for the Tar Heels. He also had 5 sacks this season. He's got 5 career interceptions, so he can cover. I'm really excited to see what he can do in a testing standpoint to show what kind of real athleticism he has. Because on film, he's looking like a guy that should be running maybe below 4.5. He's got that kind of explosiveness. And then at the defensive line position, I could mention a couple Texas players, but how about Byron Murphy the second, 297-pound bowling ball? And that's a positive analysis here. This guy is a game wrecker, splitting gaps, really quick first step, shorter, stockier guy, not Poona Ford stocky for a Texas defensive lineman, but we're talking 6'1", 297, around 300 pounds. He is a couple Big Macs away from 300 pounds, and this guy can absolutely move. I have been told from a few people with connections to Texas, he could run in the 4.8s, maybe even the high 4.7s, which would be incredible at 297 pounds. So those are two guys that I think are going to be very much on Seattle's radar at potential positions of need. Up next, as we do every year on Mock Draft Monday, we do a few of these mixed in with our own analysis, look into some of the expert mock drafts. We're going to dive into your mock draft submissions, 3-rounders today. We're going to have 4 of them. We're going to get to the first 2, including one that's got a number of trades. That would certainly excite John Schneider. We'll get to those here in a moment on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on your favorite NBA players and teams. You can have quick bets, such as who's going to make the first basket of the night. Live games, same game parlays. Could be LeBron James and Anthony Davis to each score 25 points in the Lakers' next game. Exclusive props, such as how King James is going to get that 40,000th point and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It's Mock Draft Monday, and for the first time this year, we're moving from the experts to the real experts. We're going to let the fans let us know who the Seahawks should select in the first 3 rounds of the 2024 NFL draft. Rather than us look at day 3 prospects right now, the focus is on those first 3 rounds. The Seahawks currently have 3 picks, but 2 of them are third rounders, no second rounders since they traded it to the Giants for Leonard Williams back in October. But we gave our listeners the liberty to make some trades, Rob. And so without further ado, let's get to our first one. And this one is coming from Tony G on Threads. And this was the only one that we got where the Seahawks had 5 selections in the first 3 rounds. 2 trades, trading down to number 26 with the Buccaneers and trading down from 58 to 64 with the Chiefs to recoup a couple of extra picks. So we've got 5 selections here. Chop Robinson, the edge from Penn State. Christian Haynes, the guard from UConn. Jeremiah Trotter, linebacker Clemson. Spencer Rattler, the quarterback from South Carolina, and Ben Sinnott, the tight end from Kansas State. Rob, this is certainly an intriguing first one, and I think John Schneider would probably be jumping for joy if he could get 5 selections this way in the first 3 rounds.
Well, and 5 selections that basically check off an awful lot of boxes, have an awful lot of athletic ability and potential to them. This is a really intriguing draft here that, again, was submitted. Thank you so much for the different perspective here. Now, that said, Corbin, while I love the collection of talent that the Seahawks would have here, I just have some questions about how realistic this is, frankly. It's just Chop Robinson does not have the statistics to suggest that he should be selected in the top 25. But my goodness, does he have the burst? Does he have the bend? And this is not a terrific draft class in terms of edge rushers. So when you really kind of put the binoculars on with what Chop Robinson is going to do, and I expect Chop Robinson's stock to absolutely explode this week. I mean, because again, we're going to see some 40-yard dash times, some 10-yard split times, some change of direction times. And what he does very well is just explode off of the football. And that has never been more valuable than in today's NFL. So for Seattle to trade down a couple of different times, have number 26 overall selection and have Chop Robinson be available to them, I'd be surprised, frankly. Now, again, I don't think that he is as good of a player as his athletic ability projects, but I do think that he is going to be selected very, very high in this draft class. Now, Christian Haynes, on the other hand, I think is a really good football player. His physicality, he really wasn't very impressive at the Senior Bowl. Jeremiah Trotter, frankly, as a linebacker, I'm not quite as high on as a lot of people seem to be. I definitely recognize the production that he had at Clemson and the fact that he, of course, has the NFL bloodlines with his father being a very good football player for a long time. But Jeremiah Trotter Sr. and Jeremiah Trotter Jr., the one who is shown there for those of you watching on YouTube at Clemson, are very different players. Jeremiah Trotter Sr. was a big, almost oversized linebacker. Jeremiah Trotter Jr., the linebacker for Clemson, who is now, of course, a draft possibility for the Seahawks, is actually a little bit undersized, plays a little bit more of a safety role. I really like the selection of Spencer Rattler, the quarterback, who is among my favorite middle round prospects in this year's draft class. And Ben Sinnott is a tight end that I think would make an awful lot of sense for the Seahawks. Corbin, to me, this feels like a John Schneider draft, one that I like some players that have some question marks about some of the other players. What you have no question about in this particular draft class, and again, thank you for submitting it, is the fact that these are all very productive football players at elite competition and very much check a lot of boxes as far as the positions of concern for the Seahawks: offensive line, linebacker, tight end, and a quarterback to boot. I think John Schneider would be pretty happy with this draft class, frankly.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that this has a Schneider-esque look to it, because there are some picks here that I would be scratching my head about a little bit in terms of value for different reasons. As you mentioned, I think Chop Robinson goes in the first 15 picks because the guy has elite athleticism, and those kind of guys just don't grow on trees, especially in this draft class. And you see enough on film to suggest that with a little bit more work on his technique, that he could just absolutely explode. There were a lot of close calls for him getting after the quarterback. I think with a little more technique, a little more polish, this guy can be a quarterback hunter at the next level. And as for Jeremiah Trotter Jr., I loved his dad. I thought his dad was a great player. But as you mentioned, these two are totally different. Now, in today's NFL, you can be a lighter linebacker and you can succeed. We see it with a lot of teams in the league because of the fact that it's such a spread-heavy offensive league now, and there's a lot of passing. Having athletic, smaller linebackers kind of has been invoked. But he's 210 pounds. At least that's what he was listed at. He's probably a little heavier than that, but he doesn't look much bigger than that. And that is the build of a safety. I mean, Jamal Adams weighs 214. So that is the build of a safety. And he was productive, but not as productive as a few other players at that position in his own conference, like Cedric Gray that I mentioned. So he's more of a day 3 guy to me, and mainly because of the size. There's production there, but I just worry about, is that going to translate to the next level? Ben Sinnott is a guy that I think might sneak in round 2, because if you watch the film, that dude is nasty as a run blocker. He might be the best run blocking tight end in this draft class. He is not the most athletic guy. He's probably not going to test as well as some other players, but you turn on Kansas State tape, you're going to see a damn good football player that can catch the ball. He can play fullback. He can play inline tight end. He even played some in the slot for the Wildcats. That guy is going to be a really good NFL player, in my opinion. So I think if you get him in round 3, you have to be smiling. You got to be grinning ear to ear. Let's get to our next one here. And this one's coming from Talshwal on X. And this one, there's only 4 picks, Rob, but those of you that are watching, the Seahawks have 2 second-rounders, because this is a fascinating one, trading down from 16 to 21 while also trading 78 to get 55, moving from 21 to 24. So 2 trade downs. John Schneider has done that in the first round before a couple of times. So this would not be unprecedented. This would allow the Seahawks to have 3 picks in the first 56, which in this draft, that's going to be really difficult to do because it's a very top-heavy draft. I think you're going to have to pay more to move up than usual. But Jerzon Newton, the DT from Illinois at number 24, Edgerrin Cooper, linebacker from Texas A&M at 55, Cooper Beebe, the guard from Kansas State at 56, and Jonah Ellis, the edge from Utah at pick number 83. Obviously, if you've been listening to this show, you know which pick I'm going to love the most of this. I love Jerzon Newton, and I don't know that he falls to number 24. Maybe it happens just because DTs, that's a position where we've seen players that they have fallen a little bit depending on their skill set. But this guy's really athletic. He's a great pass rushing interior defender. So we'll see how he ends up performing at his pro day. But I anticipate this is a guy that's going to be in that mix to maybe be in the top 15 to 20. Maybe he slips to 24. But if Seattle could get him there, I don't care if you've re-signed Leonard Williams. This guy is a player that can immediately come in and make an impact, and I think would fit really well in Mike Macdonald's scheme.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I think is going to be interesting is if he is available here, because he is a little bit smaller. This is a 6'2", 25-pound kind of a player, and so a little bit undersized the way that some NFL teams would like their pass rushers to be. But sure, if he were available to the Seahawks at number 24 overall, I think that you have to consider him. I love the fact that you have a picture here. Those of you watching on YouTube can see a picture here of Edgerrin Cooper. You can just see how rocked up this guy is, and in that particular tackle that he is making there. This is, again, one of those linebackers that can play both forward and backward. I think that is going to, again, be one of the positions of huge concern for the Seahawks. You have a guard in Cooper Beebe who is among the most physical guards in this draft class, Corbin. He can absolutely maul people at the line of scrimmage. That is something that translates to what John Schneider has always prioritized, as well as Mike Macdonald, in what he had experience with, at least with the Baltimore Ravens and previously the Michigan Wolverines. And then one of my favorite edge rushers in this class, in Jonah Ellis. Now, I personally think that Jonah Ellis is better with his hand in the dirt, being a traditional 4-3 defensive end. He's just undersized in that regard. So it would be interesting to see exactly how that he translates to, say, Mike Macdonald's scheme. But at the same time, I mean, he uses his hands. He locates the football. This is a really good football player that if he is available at number 83, then, again, I think that this could be a possible home run selection for some club. I don't think that there's quite the schematic fits in Mike Macdonald's system, that this might be in Pete Carroll's system, but still, my goodness, if the Seahawks were able to get those 4 players in this draft class, I certainly be among the people who would be very excited about what this might mean in terms of immediate impact, immediate progression on the defensive side of the ball.
Cooper Beebe is going to be one of the ones that I'm going to be watching closely at the combine, just because I'm curious to see what that 10-yard split looks like, maybe some of the change of direction skills if he participates. We've seen a lot of linemen move away from that, but he's somebody on film that I see some athleticism, but I also have some questions. So I want to see how he looks in these workouts, but he's certainly a player that could be in the mix of day 2. And there's plenty of good run blocking film. If you've watched Kansas State, you know that Cooper Beebe can get after it as a run blocker. We're going to get to 2 more mock drafts coming up next year on Mock Draft Monday here on Locked On Seahawks. Locked On Seahawks is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you'd do if you had an extra hour in your day? For me, I wish I had a bit more time for painting and creating artwork. The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs, and they can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. Therapy worked wonders for me over the last year dealing with family-related health issues, but don't just take my word for it. If you have somebody in your corner to guide you when you're struggling to navigate obstacles, it is invaluable. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make more. Learn to do more time, or learn to have more time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/lockedon. Greetings, 12s. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It's Mock Draft Monday, and for the first time this offseason, we're moving from the experts to the real experts. You, our valued listeners, and diving into some fan-submitted mock drafts. We had some really interesting ones in the second segment. Let's see what we have on tap here coming up next from SRQ 509 on X. And this is one that I think Rob's going to have a lot of excitement breaking down. First round, number 23 after trading down Byron Murphy the second. Talked about him a little bit earlier, the defensive tackle from Texas. At pick 59, Michael Penix stays in Seattle with the Seahawks. And then in the third round, picks 81 and 85, Chris Jenkins, the DT from Michigan, and James Williams, who was a safety in college, but he is being listed as a linebacker coming into the NFL. He is selected out of Miami with pick number 85. This is really kind of an interesting one in the sense, Rob, that this would be, at least in my opinion, a draft that would assume Leonard Williams is not a Seattle Seahawk, because I don't see why you would invest 2 of your first 3 picks in defensive tackles if you have Draymond Jones, Jaron Reed, and Leonard Williams all on your roster.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's really intriguing, because, you know, to allocate the amount of money that the Seahawks are expected to spend if they are going to be bringing back a guy in Leonard Williams who's going to be turning 30, then, you know, you might just say, heck with it. Let's just draft some players here. And so if you were going to go with a couple of defensive tackles here in the first couple of rounds, and you felt confident that you would get a penetrator like Byron Jones the second, this is a former running back. I mean, Corbin, I understand why you're so excited about him. As the former running back yourself, and certainly as a coach as well, you're going to be very excited about a guy like a Byron Jones who is a pure penetrator. If you're looking for a guy in this draft class who might remind you physically of Justin Matabuke, who of course had a spectacular season this past year for Mike Macdonald in Baltimore, then Byron Murphy II might just be that guy. So I definitely understand their rationale. And if you're able to get Chris Jenkins, a guy that I see as a first round caliber prospect, he probably won't get drafted that high because the tape was as up and down as the Grand Canyon. But still, the traits are undeniable. So if the Seahawks are able to get a Byron Murphy in the first round, a Chris Jenkins in the third round, sign me up. I mean, this is exactly the type of defensive line that I'm excited about the Seahawks perhaps to provide here. But at the same time, I just don't know that it's quite as realistic, especially if you're going to suddenly have Michael Penix Jr. somewhere in the second round, in this mix, and then you're going to flip back here and still be able to get quality player. I'm sorry, I forgot who the last selection was there. Oh, and James Williams. Oh my goodness. I mean, again, we're going back to a Pete Carroll, John Schneider kind of a draft here with, as you mentioned, Corbin, James Williams played safety at Miami. He looks like Cam Chancellor. This is 6'3", 225 pounder that is now going to be asked to play linebacker because nobody uses linebacker or nobody uses defensive backs who have the size of a Cam Chancellor except the Seattle Seahawks. So James Williams is one of the players I considered in the opening of our show. Like that could be a guy the Seahawks are very much watching to see how he performs here because obviously, again, linebacker is a position of concern and the Seahawks have prioritized big physical safeties in the past. But that's a little bit different than what Mike Macdonald has, prioritized in the past. So this is an interesting draft class for me. I love the talent that Seattle is bringing in, and I wish I had more time to kind of talk about Michael Penix, but of course we talked about him so much. There is an awful lot of talent in this particular draft class. I don't know that it is the most realistic, at least in my perspective, the way I look at it right now, actually coming to fruition.
Yeah, I think the two middle picks are the ones that I would have questions about the availability. I know there are plenty of people out there that are saying, well, Michael Penix is going to be 25. He's got an injury history. Those are all real things. But if he goes out there and throws the way that I anticipate he's going to at the combine, and you've got the film, you've seen what he's done in Ryan Grubb's offense the last 2 years, I'll be shocked if he is still available at that stage in the second round. If the Seahawks even trade to have a second round pick, I'd be surprised if he is still there for them. And Chris Jenkins, that is one I would be just absolutely, what's a word beyond stunned? I would be shell-shocked if he is there beyond the middle of the second round. With his athleticism, he's another guy that I thought about for our first segment because he is extremely athletic. Obviously, he's got the bloodline to it. His dad being a former all-pro defensive tackle in the NFL. Play was up and down, but when it was up, it was extremely good. So that is somebody that I could absolutely see being gone late first, potentially middle of second. I don't see him falling much further than that unless he really has a horrible combine, which I'm just not anticipating. Let's get to our last one here, and this one's coming from X-Ray Bird on X, and we picked this one, Rob, because we wanted to have one where there weren't any trades, and it's literally just take the picks you have and pick the players that are available, the best player available. And in my opinion, this is the most realistic one that we got in terms of player value. I think Jackson Powers Johnson at pick number 16, we've talked about it already. I think he's a mid first round pick. So this would be right in the wheelhouse for a guy that can play center, can play guard. Braylon Trice, Washington Husky fans know him very well. A player that certainly has had productive seasons at Washington. He could be a second rounder if he has a really good combine, but there are some question marks about where does his athleticism stack up? Is he going to be able to translate his production to the next level? So I think he is squarely a day two player. Tavondre Sweat from Texas would be the only player here that I'm thinking 81. That seems like a stretch that he's going to be there because we're talking about a massive human being that is really athletic for his size. Made a lot of plays in the middle of Texas's line, maybe because he's more of a run stuffer. He ends up falling, and those players haven't been picked as early, but that is still a player that I could see round two. I've even seen some mocks where he's getting picked in the first round just because he is a really difficult player to move at the line of scrimmage. And we know the Seahawks could use somebody like that.
Oh, we absolutely could. And I agree with you 100% that this feels in some ways the most realistic of the mock drafts that we have seen to this point, just because I do think that it's going to be more difficult to make the types of trades that we have seen John Schneider make in the past, because frankly, this is not as gifted of a draft class as we've seen in the past. And a large part of that is because of the NIL and the transfer portal. There's a lot of college players that were previously just kind of, influenced by the allure of the mighty dollar into jumping into the NFL perhaps earlier than they should have. And now they have an awful lot of financial reasons to stay at the college football level. So again, I just don't know that the Seahawks are going to be able to make as many trades as maybe they have in the past. One of the things I love about this draft is the fact that it is just all in on the line of scrimmage. And that, frankly, is where I think that the Seahawks struggle the most. I really think that they have the skill position talent on offense, quarterback, receiver, running back, et cetera, and the skill position talent in the secondary to compete in the NFL at the absolute highest of level, where they got their butts kicked repeatedly is a lot of the line of scrimmage. And that, again, is where this draft focuses in on. Jackson Powers Johnson is a really good football player. I personally would like a guy that has a little bit more tackle guard flexibility than center guard flexibility. I'm a big fan of Olu Oluwatimi. I mentioned him. I said OC in a previous show, Corbin, because I don't know. I was thinking about his position rather than his name. And so I apologize when I mentioned that before, but I really believe that Oluwatimi is going to be your starting center of the future. There's a possibility the Seahawks bring back Damian Lewis. Maybe they go the free agent route. Maybe they go with a prospect in the first round. That's one of the reasons why I mentioned the players I did, Troy Fautanu and JC Latham, in our first segment here. I think that is going to be the position that Seahawks fans should be paying attention to because this offensive line class is spectacular. That said, I also believe that the Seahawks are not as likely to go with defensive linemen because I do believe that Leonard Williams is likely to be retained. You have a quality player in a Jaron Reed. You got some guys like a Cameron Young, like a Mike Montgomery that you drafted a year ago that you're believing are going to be kind of the players of the future here. So again, I do think that the Seahawks are going to focus in on the line of scrimmage early. I would love to see a tight end in this group because to me, that is one of the positions. I cannot see the Seahawks spending big dollars in free agency, either to retain their own guys or to bring somebody else in. I think they're going to take advantage of a tight end class that, frankly, I think is being underrated.
As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, we'll have some takeaways from our first day at the Combine. And oh, by the way, John Schneider is going to be speaking. So we'll have takeaways from Schneider's press conference and much more, kicking off a jam-packed week at Indianapolis. Make sure you're listening in. Thanks for tuning into this episode. Go Hawks.